Isn't it interesting how so many different ancient cultures cut and moved stones with such precision? The megalithic stone structures of the ancient world are the most mysterious, as it isn't really clear how they were moved and placed into their positions. But how did ancient people carve stones, small or megalithic in size, with such precision? There are so many ancient structures with stones carved so precisely, you can't even stick a sheet of paper between the stones. There are modern theories as to how it was done, but there are also ancient legends about it. One legend describes how King Solomon was able to cut the stones used for building the first Jewish temple. The legend says that something called the Shamir was used to shape the stones. It said the Shamir was used to carve the stones because the law prohibited using iron tools, which could be used in war, to build the temple. The temple was to be a place of peace, so they didn't want to use tools that could also be used as weapons. But what is a Shamir? It's said it is a type of worm or some kind of substance or stone. I think it varies depending on what version of the legend you read. My usual go-to source for old Jewish legends is Louis Ginzberg's book, The Legends of the Jews. In this version, the Shamir is described as a reptile, and along with a salamander is said to be the most marvelous of the reptiles. It was one of the last things created at the twilight of the sixth day of creation, just before the first Sabbath when God rested. But what happened to it? Unlike the salamander, which you can still find running around on Earth today, where is this Shamir that can supposedly cut right through solid stone? Is it a reptile? Is it a worm? Well, despite being described as if it is some living creature initially, when it comes to cutting stone, it sounds more like some kind of tool. King Solomon was not the first one to use the Shamir. Being that it was created during Creation Week, it was already around during the time of Moses, long before Solomon was born. Moses used it when creating the first breastplate for the high priest. The names of the 12 tribes of Israel were first laid out in stones on the breastplate and then written over in ink, and then the ink was traced over using the Shamir, which carved the names into the breastplate. The stones were apparently fused into it, and it said that the wonderful circumstance was that the friction wore no particles from the stones. I think that is another way of saying the Shamir didn't leave behind any tool marks, which is interesting considering that some of these ancient structures with stones cut with laser-like precision oftentimes don't show any tool marks, or at least not tool marks that you'd expect from the type of tools they were known to have in ancient times. If King Solomon was using the Shamir to cut stones for the first temple, I'd expect the stones of the first temple would be precision cut like some other ancient structures around the world. We don't know exactly what the stones of the first temple look like because the Temple Mount is currently occupied by the Dome of the Rock, and archaeological excavations are not allowed there. So even if any of the original temple stones are still buried on the Temple Mount, it doesn't look like anyone is going to find them, at least not anytime soon. So what exactly is this Shamir? Granted, this is just a legend and we don't know if it really even existed, but for the sake of speculation, let's just say it did. But what is it? Even though it's initially described as a reptile or worm, it doesn't seem likely that that's what it actually was. For one, it was created on the last day of creation. If it was a living creature of some sort, it would have already been dead by the time of Moses. With that in mind, maybe the Shamir that Moses and Solomon used wasn't the original Shamir from Creation Week, but was something else that they described as a Shamir because of what it did. When we look at these precision-cut stones with our modern eyes, it's often described as laser-like precision. But the ancients didn't have lasers, so they wouldn't have described these types of cuts as laser-like. Instead, they may have described it using something they were more familiar with. They were familiar with worms, and they saw the kind of holes worms could create, so maybe they described this object as a Shamir because it could cut through stone like a worm could gnaw through the earth. Some ancient stonework also have holes that look like they were drilled into them. At this point, if we were to assume the Shamir used by Moses and Solomon isn't a living creature but some kind of object, and it should probably be also noted here that the way Moses and Solomon used it gives you the impression it is some kind of object and not some kind of living creature with a mind of its own that they couldn't control or direct. But what is it? It's said to be the size of barley corn, and I'm not entirely sure if barley corn is barley or corn. But whatever the case may be, either way, it's safe to say it's described as being a small object. I've heard it suggested that it might be some kind of radioactive object, which is an interesting thought because the legend also says that when not in use, it could not be stored in an iron vessel because it would burn right through the iron. Instead, it had to be wrapped in a woolen cloth and then placed in a lead basket filled with barley bran. Now, I'm not entirely sure how a woolen cloth or barley bran would help, considering it could burn through iron, but isn't it interesting that it had to be placed in a lead basket? Specifically lead. In our time, we know that lead can be used to block radiation, but how would they have known that in ancient times? It does kind of sound like the Shamir could have been some kind of object that could be used to direct radiation to a certain spot like a laser. It's also possible the object didn't have radiation as we understand it today, but it had some kind of supernatural properties that no longer exist in the modern world and therefore cannot be studied or explained. So what happened to the Shamir? The legend says it was lost at the time of the destruction of the first temple when Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian army invaded. Another version I've heard says the Shamir lost its potency at that time. In other words, it no longer worked. Which, if it was a radioactive object, it is plausible because it's possible that over time the object lost its radioactivity. Even if you could find the object today, you probably wouldn't know you found it because it probably doesn't work anymore. Which is probably a good thing because even if it wasn't a radioactive object, it still had to be stored in a lead basket, so I don't think it's the kind of thing that you would want to touch with your bare hands or even be close to without some kind of hazmat suit or something like that. So what do you think the Shamir was? Was it a reptile or worm? Was it a radioactive object? Or was it an object with a magical, supernatural power we don't know about because it no longer exists in our modern world? Did it even exist at all? What do you think? Those are my thoughts on that. Thanks for listening.